Hey everybody, in today's video I'm going to show you how you can create a chart in Excel that not only maps two different values but compares the differences between them and highlights them by showing a gap. And I'm going to show you also how you can customize that gap so that way it'll show a different color or a different pattern based on which value is higher. So that way you can know right away by just looking at the chart which value is higher and the size of that gap all in one. So to make this chart work, I'm going to have to set up multiple fields, multiple helper columns to ensure that this is plotted properly, and then I've got the gaps starting and ending from the right position, and that there's different fields there so that I can differentiate between the different investments. In this case, I've got investment A and investment B, and over the different periods, I have their returns. So if investment A was higher, then I want the gap to look different versus if it was investment B that was higher. So there's a lot of different fields I need to set up here. The first one I'm going to call my starting field. So this is my starting value, and this is going to be the starting point for my gap. So I want this value to be closest to 0 on the vertical axis, on the y-axis. So how this is going to work is I'm going to use an if function to start with and say, use the and function as well, because I want two conditions here. I want it, if both of these values are less than 0, so they're negative, then what I'm going to do is take the maximum value, because I want to be closest to 0. Otherwise, what I'm going to do is take the minimum value, get the lowest value. And so we can see 19.53, that's the lesser value of these two. That is closest to 0. Now, in this case, we've got a negative and a positive. So I'm going to take the smallest amount because I'm going to have a gap that crosses over that 0 value and goes positive afterwards. Here we've got a negative value. Negative 13 is closer to 0 than negative 16, so that is correct. So my formula is set up properly for the starting field. Next, what I'm going to do is create a couple fields for the potential for a crossover, like when I have a positive and negative return, and I want to ensure that my gap crosses over that zero value. And so there's a negative piece and a positive piece. I'm going to create two fields because I want my gaps to look different based on, again, if investment A is higher or investment B is higher. So I'm going to call this crossover A and crossover B. And so what I'm going to do here is say that I'm just going to take the starting value if there is a crossover, but I'm going to determine based on which investment value is higher. So for example, I'm going to use an if function again and say, okay, if investment A was greater than investment B, then I'm going to use an if function and I'm going to multiply these two returns, basically just to check that they're the same, whether they're both positive or they're both negative. So in other words, their symbols are the same. So if I multiply them and they're greater than 0, then I know they're both positives and they're both negatives. In which case, I do not need a crossover amount because they're both on the same side, either both positive or both negative. Now, if it's not the case, then I'm going to just take this starting value here. Then I'm going to close this. And so if the condition is not met, then I'm going to set it to 0. So this is only going to be in the situation where I've got positive and negative values. So if I copy this down, convert this into percentages. So here I've got a crossover amount that matches my criteria because it's taking the starting value. And in this case, investment A was the better performing one at 0% versus negative 11.4%. And I'm going to copy this formula over and apply the same logic over here. The difference being now I'm going to flip this. So it's going to check the opposite, checking if investment B was the better performing investment. So I'm going to copy this. And in this case, now I've got this crossover amount here at minus 10.14% here, because in this case, investment B was the better return. So this is where it's important to separate these fields differently, because I want these gaps to populate based on which stock or which investment was the better return. So I'm going to have a series for A and for B. So I want to be able to differentiate so that their colors or their fill colors, the gaps can look different based on which investment performed better that year. Next, I'm going to create a couple columns for the differences. So I'm going to set up difference A and difference B. So again, two different columns here, one for each series. And in this case, I'm going to use an if function, and the idea being this is going to be the bulk of the gap. But this formula is going to be a bit more complicated because I've got to factor in for multiple things, whether there's crossover and which investment was the better performing one. So again, I'm going to check if investment A performed better than investment B. That's my first qualifier. If that's true, the next thing I'm going to check is if that crossover amount was equal to 0 or not. So I'm checking if it's not equal to 0, meaning there's something there, then I'm just going to take the maximum value in this range, because the idea that crossover amount is going to be coupled in with the gap for whatever the maximum value is to create one long gap. And you'll see this on the chart when I plot it out. So that's if there is a value in the crossover amount. Now, if there isn't, then I'm going to do another if function and say if this starting value is greater than 0. So in other words, I'm dealing with two positive amounts because I've ruled out there's a crossover. And by checking that this is greater than 0, I know they're both positives. In this case, I'm going to use the max function to get the largest value here and deduct the lowest value using the min function. And so this looks like a really complicated formula, but it's not actually that complex. I'm using just max and mins. And if it's not a positive value, so in other words, this is negative, then what I'm going to do is take the minimum value here and subtract the maximum value. So I'm doing the reverse if it's a negative. And so this looks like a bit of a messy formula, but I'll leave a link in the description to this video if you want to follow along and just do a copy and paste of this formula. But that's how that looks. So I'm going to copy this down, and what I'm also going to do is copy this formula as well over to difference B and flip this sign once more. That's the only difference in the formula. Everything else, the logic is going to be the same. So now if we compare this, we can say that there is a difference of about 12%, which is correct here. So between 31% and 19.5%, and investment B was the larger, better performing investment. So that went into column H, which is correct. Now, if we look at this next value, we had that crossover amount for a column for the year 2000. Now, actually, this one is wrong because I needed to update the crossover amount. It's looking at crossover A instead of crossover B. So I just need to make that adjustment. There we go. Now I've got that set up correctly. So that's one additional change I forgot to make there. So in this case, it's just taking that positive amount from investment B. So again, I've got two gaps there, one for that crossover and one for the remaining portion. So there's two pieces in there. And so if I look down here, again, I got a 20% difference between 23.9 and 3%. So this looks to be populating correctly. So we can see difference A, a bunch of zeros in here. So we can see during these years, investment B was the better option. But then as we get down to over here, we can see investment A is the better one. And so it's populating. So it looks like these values are populating correctly. So now I can go to the next stage and actually put this on a chart. So to put these on a chart, I'm just going to go to Insert, open up Charts, and I'm going to go to the All Charts tab and select a combo. And for the period, I'm going to remove the period, but for now, I'm just going to set it to a line with markers. Do the same for investment A and for investment B. And then everything else is going to be a stacked column. I don't need to put these on a different axis because I want them to be the same, so that their values all line up and the gaps line up accordingly. So everything's a stacked column. I'm going to hit OK. And right now this chart looks completely wrong. But what I'm going to do is right click, select the data, And I'm going to remove that period because I don't want the dates on here. I'm going to remove that. And now it's starting to look a little better. I'm going to update the axis labels here because right now I've just got numbers. And I'm going to select the label range for my periods here. And I'm going to need to do the same thing for the starting value for the column. So I did it for the lines, and Excel automatically updates for all the line charts. Now I'm going to change this for the columns as well. So I'm just going to select the same range. And you can see the columns are updated as well. So I've got that set up properly. And I'm going to move these columns down below because right now it's a bit messy here. So I'm going to right click, format the axis, and under labels, select low. Pushes them down there. So I'm going to stretch this out to make it have a bit more room. And what I can do to the home tab, make these values a bit smaller so it's easier to see them. There we go. Next, what I'm going to do is, although I set line with markers, I actually don't want the line. So I'm going to select one of these lines, click on the fill bucket, and select no line. And I'm going to do this same thing for the green one, no line as well. So now we've got our values. Now it's starting to look a bit like what I intended here. So we've got our values, and we've got those gaps here. Now, what I'm going to do is select my starting value, which is in blue right now. And for the fill option, I'm going to select it to no fill and no line because I don't want that to be visible. That's really my starting point. So as you can see now, it's basically where that gap is supposed to start, but I don't want that starting gap to be visible. Now, some of these gaps still look a bit funny. Like this one should be over here, but it's actually over here. And this has to do with how the data is ordered. So I want to right click again, go to select data. And in order for this to plot properly, I want to make sure my crossover amounts are highest, followed by my starting amount, and then the differences. So now when I change that, now the gaps look proper. Now I've got different colors here, and this is where we just want to adjust the look and feel of these values. So let's say for crossover A, if I go, I can put in a solid fill. I can change this however I want. But actually, we just want to make sure that we've got the entire series selected. If I go to pattern fill, let's say I want to make this a black fill with dashes going across like that. I'm going to do the same thing for difference A as well. And this is why I labeled them this way. So it's clear that this is relates to investment A, this one to investment A as well. So if I go to pattern fill, I'm going to do the same thing here. And now you can see now it's easy to differentiate the ones where investment A was the better return. And this is the one that had the orange dots on top. So if I want to change these dots, I can do that as well. If I go to marker and select a solid fill, let's say I'll do a yellow so it stands out. I'll change the border color so it's black. And there we go. So now we can easily see that the yellow dots on top, we have a different gap color. Now I can do the same thing for difference B. So for difference B, let's say we've got that green green dot. I'll leave that as is. And for difference B, or I'll go to crossover B first, go to select a different pattern fill, and let's use a green one, perhaps a dark green one. And then go to difference B again, do the same thing, a pattern fill, and it remembers my color. So now just by doing this, we can easily see the differences because not only can we see the differences, we can easily identify where the differences were in favor of one value versus another. When the yellow dots are on top, we can see that the gaps are a different color versus when the green dots were on top. So this gives us a lot more information than just plotting the values and just plotting the gaps, because by having different colors, different highlights, different patterns based on those initial values, investment A, investment B in columns B and C, we can adjust these to make sure that the gaps are showing and displaying differently. And now that we've got all these values plotted properly, I can actually delete these from this legend so it looks a bit cleaner. So I'm just going to remove all these different values here. I'm still going to leave investment A, investment B, just because that's going to make it a bit cleaner, because we're going to be able to see which one relates to what. But I don't want to clutter with all those other values in the legend. And the last thing we can do is perhaps just change the title, comparing investment returns, whatever you want to call it. But as you can see, there's a lot of customization you can apply to this. And by doing it this way, it gives you a lot more control over how your chart looks, and it gives you a lot more information on your chart right in there, as opposed to just having the different returns. The key is, setting up your spreadsheet so it's organized properly and that you identify different fields based on that initial criteria, because that was key in setting up whether a value goes into crossover A versus crossover B, or difference A or difference B, because I had that initial criteria that looked at these two values first to say, okay, if this one was a better investment, then it goes in this bucket. Otherwise, it goes in the other one. And by keeping them separate, I can apply different formatting rules, different colors, different shading, and allow me to, have a more informative chart that displays a lot more information, as opposed to one that just would show the gaps or just show the returns. So that's a wrap for this video. If you did like it, please make sure to leave a like and subscribe for more. Thanks for watching.